This is My Child Will Thrive, and I'm your host, Tara Hunkin, nutritional therapy practitioner, certified GAPS practitioner, restorative wellness practitioner, and mother. I'm thrilled to share with you the latest information, tips, resources, and tools to help you on the path to recovery for your child with ADHD, autism, sensory processing disorder, or learning disabilities. My own experiences with my daughter, combined with as much training as I can get my hands on, research I can dig into, and conferences I can attend, have helped me to develop systems and tools for parents like you who feel overwhelmed trying to help their children. So sit back as I share another great topic to help you on your journey. A quick disclaimer before we get started. My Child Will Thrive is not a substitute for working with a qualified healthcare practitioner. The information provided on this podcast is not intended to diagnose or treat your child. Please consult your healthcare practitioner before implementing any information or treatments that you have learned about on this podcast. There are many gifted, passionate, and knowledgeable practitioners with hundreds, if not thousands, of hours of study and clinical experience available to help guide you. Part of our goal is to give you the knowledge and tools you need to effectively advocate for your child so that you don't blindly implement each new treatment that comes along. No one knows your child better than you. No one knows your child's history like you do or can better judge what is normal or abnormal for your child. The greatest success in recovery comes from the parent being informed and asking the right questions and making the best decisions for their child in coordination with a team of qualified practitioners in different areas of specialty. Now on with the show. Today's podcast is sponsored by the Autism, ADHD, and Sensory Processing Disorder Summit. In order to learn more about the summit and to sign up for free, please go to www.mychildwillthrive.com/summit. Hi, everyone. I want to welcome you back to the My Child Will Thrive podcast. I'm really honored to have with me today Dr. Mansoor Mohammed. He's going to be talking to us today about the importance of vitamin D. And we've heard about how vitamin D is really important for children's health and development, but we're going to go into it in much more depth than you've ever heard before. And that's why I'm so excited to have him here with me today on the podcast. Before we get started, I just want to give you a little bit of background about Dr. Mansoor. He's the president and CSO of the DNA Company, which is a leading and innovative provider of comprehensive functional genomics testing, consulting, and personalized health solutions. Dr. Mansoor is widely regarded as a pioneer in medical genomics and has been the recipient of multiple academic and industry awards. He's the holder of several patents in the general fields of molecular diagnostics and genomics research, and is one of the most sought after national and international conference speakers in the genre of personalized medicine. Dr. Mansoor maintains an active clinical practice as a genomics consultant to some of the leading executive health clinics in Canada and abroad, and he's also served on the Canadian board of the Autistic Research and is a consultant to the world-renowned Toronto Centre of Applied Genomics. He's also the genomist in residence for the Autism Hope Alliance. So we are really grateful that you've been able to take time out of your busy schedule to talk to us today, and for all the work that you've done to support this community here in Canada and throughout the world.
It's an absolute pleasure, Clara, and thank you for having me.
Yeah, so before we get started, I just want people to know that we're going to dive right into this, and we're going to get into the nitty gritty. I know a lot of the parents like to hear the deep science here, but I'll make sure that there's all sorts of resources that are linked. So if some of this is new to you and you need to listen again, you can listen to the podcast more than once, and we'll make sure that there's other resources just in case this is more than what you've heard before. Because when we start to talk about genomics, some of us do the thing that many of us do if we don't like math, we sort of say, I can't possibly understand this. The reason why I'm really glad to have Dr. Mansoor here, he does a really great job of making this very accessible to us parents and to the practitioners that are listening as well. So without further ado, I'd like to dive right in, and let's start by talking about vitamin D and whether it's misleading to think of vitamin D as just a vitamin, and where did that association come from in the first place?
It's an excellent place to start, Tara, and it is misleading to think of vitamin D as quote unquote just a vitamin. When we think of vitamins, the average individual, the average educated individual, the average individual that is taking a proactive move in their health. We think of vitamins as supplements. We think of vitamins maybe a little bit more nuanced as these nutrients or micronutrients we get from our foods. So in other words, we eat our vegetables and our fruits and we get our vitamins. In rare circumstances, you also get some of them from meats and seafood and so on and so forth. But the point being, when we think of vitamins, we think of them as these nutrients or micronutrients, and that's about where we go. Okay, nothing can be further from the truth when it comes to vitamin D. Now, where and how does vitamin D get lumped, quote unquote, which is not at all to diminish the role of true vitamins. The reality of vitamin D and why it's even called vitamin D, and in fact what we call the alphabet vitamins, A, B, C, D, the alphabet vitamins, is really one that's your classic historical tale. In other words, there are vitamins that are in fact micronutrients that we derive from foods that we eat, including the beta carotenoids, i.e. vitamin A, including the Bs, the wonderful B9 and B12 that we get from our green leafy vegetables and from meats or fermented products, respectively. So these are true vitamins. Vitamin C, of course, from our citrus fruits. When those vitamins, those alphabet vitamins were being discovered just about a little over 100 years ago, and the relevance and the importance of these micronutrients became apparent, and naming criteria was set up, such as vitamin A, then the next, vitamin B, then the next, vitamin C. So when this factor, this thing that was discovered, that was important for health, i.e. without it, and oftentimes we understand the importance of something when we have its absence. So it was understood that there was a factor that when absent was leading to rickets, i.e. bowed bones, the bowing of the bones in children. And that phenomena, that physiologic phenomena could be corrected through the inclusion of certain things in the diet. And at that point, it wasn't clear whether it was purely dietary things or environmental things. But the point being, because it was something, quote unquote, a factor that was needed for optimal health, and because of that, just that point in time, we were discovering the alphabet vitamins, the assumption was made and it was named vitamin D, literally just the in sequence of the next factor that was discovered to be important for human development, childhood development, and for later health. And of course, back then, even though it was known to be important, we had no clue how important it is. So just as a quick pause there, vitamin D, even though it's named vitamin D, once we begin to get into this, Tara, what I really want our audience to understand is that it is not a vitamin in its classic definition as per the other micronutrients, vitamin C, vitamin A, and other vitamins of its ilk. So what then is vitamin D? So we'll continue to use the moniker vitamin D simply because that's what it's referred to. But we're going to keep in mind as we go a little further, we'll understand why it is not in its reality a true vitamin. Okay, so what is vitamin D? Vitamin D is this thing, it's a molecule that we make in our skin upon sunlight exposure. And it's just really cool thing, you know, for those of us with a little bit of biology, high school biology, photosynthesis, right? That reaction that happens in plants, and the name tells what it is, photosynthesis. So it's using light, photo, to synthesize something. And we think that that is the exclusion, i.e. the exclusive nature of plants. But in reality, the human body miraculously, when our skin is exposed to sunlight, specifically the UVB, B as in Bravo, fraction of sunlight. So we need two things here. We need our skin being exposed, i.e. not being covered. We need sunlight. We need the UVB fraction of sunlight. And when that happens, with some variances for skin complexion, my skin complexion, Tara as an island boy, yourself, not quite as much pigmentation as myself. These are going to be things that will affect how much of that UVB is absorbed into the skin. And when that UVB absorbs into the skin, a remarkable and miraculous reaction occurs in which we actually take, and here's something else that many people don't know, we take that ubiquitous molecule cholesterol. Yes, that thing that sometimes we think is the big bad monster, cholesterol. Well, in fact, what happens is we take cholesterol, a cholesterol molecule, a derivative of cholesterol molecule, and that light UVB initiates a reaction that turns that cholesterol derivative into vitamin D3, i.e. the thing we call vitamin D3. So, of course, we make it in our skin. And, of course, many of us and many of the parents out there, and we should know this, we also can consume it as a supplement, D3. Now, whether the D3 is made in the skin or whether it is consumed orally, ultimately, either avenue, it ends up, the D3 ends up in our circulatory, i.e. our blood supply, our circulatory system. Now let's just pause there for a moment because it's quite time appropriate, i.e. sitting at the top of June. Something that we need to pull out here for our parents, especially all of our parents that are living in the Northern Hemispheres, Toronto, Canada, and actually, Tara, anything north of what is considered Atlanta, Georgia. So this is a shout out to any of the families and parents living north of Atlanta, Georgia. Here's the point. If you live north of Atlanta, Georgia, and this is not a genetics thing, this is not a physiology thing, this is a physics thing, this is a astronomy thing, that if you live north of Atlanta, Georgia, between about the months November to late March, April, between those months, the fraction of sunlight, UVB, that is needed, not UVA, UVB, that is needed to initiate that photosynthetic reaction in our skins, that fraction of sunlight bounces off the ozone layer of the Earth because of the tilt of the Earth during those months. So here's the important point. If you live in these northern latitudes, in those months, even if it was a sunny day, even if it was a warm enough day, even if you were able to expose, your legs and arms or something more, you're actually not absorbing near as much UVB into your skin to create that reaction. And of course, no amount of surplus or reserve vitamin D, and we're going to talk again, we're going to continue that story in the body from the summer months will last you through all of those winter months. So it's so important that northern latitude dwellers, such as us here in Toronto, general Canadian boundaries, that we understand that in these months, by the time we roll around from September into October into November, and the days are shorter and the UVB is no longer getting passed into the Earth's atmosphere, into our skin, we would have, if we were not replenishing vitamin D sources, we would have utilized all of our innate sources. Incredibly important. And then a second side note, this is a word to the wise, which is not to say that we don't have to practice safe sun exposure. We do, but what we call full spectrum sun blocks, things that block both UVA and UVB. When we go into the sun, we've got to appreciate that UVB blocker, and more sunscreens no longer block UVB because of this fact. But just in case anyone is using full spectrum sunscreens, again, I do emphasize safe sun exposure, but we've got to understand that if we use these UVB blockers, again, we are prohibiting the thing that the body was naturally meant to do. Okay, so now we get to the point that we've made this what we're calling vitamin D3. This is a precursor. And so what is the thing that we need to understand here, Tara? This precursor, D3, that you either make in your skin or that you take orally, is going to be turned into a hormone. And let's emphasize this. You see, Tara, if you tell the average adult, the average individual that is, intelligent about the human body, that they've got a thyroid hormone problem, that they're hypothyroidic, or that they've got an estrogen hormone problem, or that they've got an insulin problem, that would immediately ring a certain degree of alertness. I've got to address this. That's a hormonal problem. I've got to address this. Well, let's make it clear that what we're about to say here regarding vitamin D, the hormone, it is a hormone with all of the importance, with all of the characteristics, as important as insulin, estrogen, testosterone, thyroid hormones, growth hormone. It is a hormone, and there are many well-meaning health writers, Tara, that talk about it as, you'll hear things that it's a precursor, it's a prohormone. D3 is the precursor prohormone. What happens next is that the human body will turn this into a bona fide hormone, and then we'll talk about what do hormones do, why is this so important, and why any parent interested in the optimal health of their children would want to know about this and be sure that this is being optimized. And at this juncture, Tara, before we go any further, I can't help but then also point out the sad indication, probably wrong choice of words, the concern that I have that vitamin D as a blood test used to be covered through our medical health coverage here in Ontario through OHIP. In some years now, it's been removed from OHIP coverage. In other words, it's not paid for. Doesn't mean that we can't get it. It just means that we're going to have to pay a few bucks for it. But here's the point. Somehow we sometimes are led, and even our clinicians are led to believe, well, because vitamin D is no longer covered by our insurance, it means it's not important. So you see what happened there? Here's this thing that we're going to talk about that's so important. Someone at the level of, costs and benefits and ratios and financing made a decision that this thing, blood testing for vitamin D levels, was no longer covered. And just because of that, there's been this psychological association that because it's no longer covered, ipso facto, it means it's not important. Again, audience, nothing could be further from the truth. Why it's not covered, that's a conversation not for me to have, but let me, by the end of this, emphasize, just because it's not covered, by no means make it not important. So now we come back to that D3. We've made it in the skin, and we're starting to make a bit of it in the sunlight that we're getting, or we've been taking it orally, D3. It gets into the gut, it gets into the bloodstream. Now what happens? That D3, it's a fat-soluble molecule, and the blood is a water-based medium. So how do you get fat-soluble things to be dissolved and transported in a water-based medium? You put it in a taxi cab. This is the remarkable way that the body gets around this. The blood, our major circulatory system, the highways of the body, transport water-soluble things. And if the thing happened to be fat-soluble, the body gets around this by encompassing that fat-soluble thing in a taxi cab, a shell, a matrix. And so the transporter of D3 and the other D3 derivatives, including the hormonal vitamin D that we're going to talk about, is transported by a molecule, by a transporter known as vitamin D binding protein. And you will understand the importance of each of these things that I'm pulling out here shortly. So we've got this taxi cab of vitamin D and its derivatives known as vitamin D binding protein. So the vitamin D binding protein absorbs the D3 from the skin, the circulation in the skin, or from the gut, pulls it into the bloodstream, takes it to the liver, and it is in the liver that a special enzyme, CYP2R1, CYP2 River 1, this enzyme converts D3 into its intermediate 25 hydroxy vitamin D or 25 hydroxy calciferol. These are synonyms. Now, again, I'm going to call this out for what's going to come next. I want to alert everyone that if and when you do go to the doctor, and if and when you do get a vitamin D test, blood test, serum test, often what is tested is your 25 hydroxy calciferol, that thing that is made in the liver. And that's important. That's a good indicator. But what you're going to know now, next, is that that is not a complete or full indicator of what is happening in your body. Why? Because the 25 hydroxy vitamin D, 25 hydroxy calciferol, here on forth, I'm just going to use the vitamin D as the simpler way of saying it, 25 hydroxy vitamin D, is simply a precursor. It's actually not yet doing anything in the body, except it then, having been made in the liver,
by the CYP2R1 enzyme from the D3 from the skin or your supplement. Now vitamin D binding protein, the same taxicab that took the D3 to the liver, picks back up the 25-hydroxy vitamin D from the liver, takes it to the kidney, wherein another enzyme, another really important enzyme, CYP27B1, a sister to CYP2R1, another enzyme in the liver, finishes the activation of the vitamin D, converts it from 25-hydroxy vitamin D to 1,25-dihydroxy vitamin D. That is your hormone. That is the hormone in all of its glory, like testosterone, estrogen, insulin. So now let's pause for a moment. Your kidney and the tubules of the kidney has now, through that enzymatic reaction, we've made this hormone. The kidney is going to secrete, yes, the kidney secretes the hormone into the bloodstream, 1,25-dihydroxycalciferol, which, yes, is fat soluble, which, yes, is picked back up by a vitamin D binding protein. And now it circulates and it's delivered to all of the cells of the body, including radically important neural cells of the body, and so on and so forth. So now let's just pause for a moment. Hormones. So we've now entered, we've established a few physiologic things, and we've established a precedent that vitamin D is just a misnomer, if you want to call the D3 a vitamin, but it is then activated into a hormone. So how do hormones work? What are hormones? How do they work? And why are they so important as we associate with insulin and thyroid hormone and testosterone and estrogens? Now we have to put vitamin D, the 1,25-dihydroxycalciferol, everyone at this pause. If you choose to sign off, don't. But if you choose to sign off at this point, you now understand 1,25-dihydroxycalciferol is a hormone, one that you wouldn't want to meddle with just as much as you wouldn't want to be deficient in the other hormones that I've mentioned. So what are hormones? Hormones, Tariq, very quickly, are defined as factors. They are molecules, things that are made, and they are made in one part of the body. This is the classic biology textbook of a definition of a hormone. It is made in one part of the body, enters the bloodstream, but affects the entire body. So we make thyroid hormones in this little butterfly organ here, enters the body, and as we know how important that is. We make our estrogens, our testosterone, ovaries, testes, depending on sex, and so on and so forth. So kidneys here act as the organ producing the vitamin D hormone. It enters into the bloodstream and it has its impact, which brings us to the very quick point. What and how do hormones, how does it impact the body? How does testosterone cause the androgenization, the creation of that pubescent male features and female features? Because girls, we also produce testosterone when you have your first period and become pubescent. Boys, we also produce estrogens when, you know, and biologic sex here we're speaking, okay? We produce both estrogens and androgens. So as a very quick example, how do these hormones, androgens, testosterone and estrogens, it has such an obvious impact on the body. How does it do this? Well, here is the second feature of hormones. The first feature, it's produced in an organ, enters into the bloodstream, and even though it was produced in one part of the body, the first feature of a hormone is that it impacts the entire body because it enters into the bloodstream. The second feature of a hormone is all hormones have their respective receptors. Receptors are like the docking stations. Think Star Trek. It's the docking station that the hormone is circulating in the bloodstream, and all cells will have their respective receptors. So cells have androgen receptors that pick up testosterone. Cells have estrogen receptors that pick up estrogens, insulin receptors, and so on and so forth. Cells have vitamin D receptors. So when that 1,25-dihydroxycalciferol is in the bloodstream circulating in its taxicab vitamin D binding protein, it takes it to the cell, it opens up the garage door in the cell, the docking station, it enters the vitamin D, 1,25-dihydroxycalciferol, into the cell, wherein it binds its receptor. That's the same as all hormones. Now the third feature of all hormones. So how did the hormone testosterone cause that muscle definition, that facial hair? How did the estrogens create those curves and the initial signs of young womanhood in the female recipient, and so on and so forth? When a hormone binds its receptor, second feature of hormones, it enters into the nucleus. It enters into the vault, the nucleus of our cells, wherein we keep all of our genes, all 22,000 genes, and hormones with their receptors, that complex known as the hormone receptor complex, actually is the thing that binds to our DNA at special places in our genetic makeup and turns on genes of relevance. So now let's pause there. You see, Tara, of our 22,000 genes that make up our human genetic operating manual that tells the body how to do all of the wonderful jobs that it needs to do, subsets of genes are recognized by these hormone receptor complexes, and those subsets of genes get turned on when the hormone receptor complex enters the nucleus. Very quick example. So when you eat something that is carby, a starch, rice, potato, or a dessert, sugar, when you eat something that ultimately raises sugar in the bloodstream, the body produces, the pancreas, the islets of Langerhans, produces insulin. The insulin binds to the insulin receptor. This insulin receptor goes into your DNA, into your nucleus, and guess what genes insulin receptor are turning on? They're turning on, unsurprisingly, all of the genes, all of the mechanisms responsible for sugar metabolism. They're turning on all of the genes that your body and your cells needed to have turned on in order to burn sugar and gain energy. As a quick note, that's the first thing insulin receptor does. But if you continue to keep too much insulin in your body, i.e. because you're eating too much sugars or because you're insulin resistant, now insulin receptor starts to turn on genes that cause inflammation in your body, which is why that is a pro-inflammatory thing when we consume too much sugars. And there's a reason that I mentioned what I just did. So now we come back to vitamin D, Tara. So we think and we're led to believe, let's summarize, vitamin D is a vitamin. It's responsible for bone development and teeth. And after all, my child has stopped growing. They're post-pubescent, so their bones are fine. And we don't need vitamin D anymore. And guess what? OHIP no longer covers it. So that really means that it's not important. Well, of the 22,000 genes in our genetic library, in our operating manual, 1/10, 2,200 genes and counting are turned on, meaning they are operationalized, meaning 1/10 of our operating manual cannot do its job efficiently unless vitamin D receptor enters into the nucleus and turns on those genes. 1/10 of our operating manual, not just the parts of the operating manual responsible for healthy teeth or healthy bones, calcification of our bones. The majority of our genes responsible for how our body deals with inflammation. We just heard that when insulin and its insulin receptor turns on genes for too long, it starts to turn on the genes that cause inflammation. Well, guess what vitamin D does? Vitamin D, 1,25-dihydroxycholesterol, and its receptor turn those genes off. It takes your body from a pro-inflammatory state to a less inflammatory state. Of the genes that vitamin D and its receptor turn on, the genes involved in how we respond, i.e. the operations that our cells need to respond to viral infections. Of the genes involved are the genes of neurologic mapping and development. So when that beautiful little brain is still being mapped, the whole beautiful network of signaling, the proper mapping, the proper electrician wiring of the brain, the genes that direct the wiring of the brain requires the vitamin D receptor to turn on those genes. Something as simple as the way the genes that are required for our prefrontal cortex, the nucleus accumbens, the pleasure center of the brain, the part of the brain, the neurons in the brain that respond to dopamine, that allows us to feel elated, but not just elated, allows us to focus, because part of attention is that you've got to enjoy, you've got to have some degree of being captured by something. It's a dopaminergic response. Well, for that part of your brain to even respond to dopamine such that you can be engaged, that part of the brain and its operations are under the control of other things, but hugely under the control of 1,25-dihydroxycalciferol and its receptor. So let's quickly pause there and summarize. Nothing can be further from the truth. This is not a vitamin in its classic micronutrient. It is a hormone. And if you can, well, here's your barometer, listeners, parents. If your barometer is, you understand that your doctor told you you are hypothyroidic, you're not producing enough thyroid hormone, or mums out there, your doctor tells you you are entering into menopause because now your estrogen levels are really nosediving, or your endocrinologist tells you, you're at risk for type 2 diabetes because you're not producing enough insulin, or your body isn't responding to that insulin. If all of those things elicit in you a response that says, oh my goodness, I have to address this, please understand that you should have the exact response if you hear that your vitamin D levels are too low, because you are hearing that an all-important hormone with its myriad of impacts on the body, i.e. its myriad of impacts through 2,200 and counting genes, 1/10 of the human genome, including the genes that are responsible for how your body responds to your sex hormones. Fathers, men, teenage boys out there, and girls, if you don't have enough vitamin D, your body isn't going to respond to your sex hormones responsible for that adolescent growth and development. Vitamin D. So Tara, I think we can pause there now. I hope we've elicited something as to the importance. Now let's quickly cover this, or very quickly, 2 minutes, the genetics of this. So what did we highlight? We highlighted that there is a taxi cab, vitamin D binding protein, that has to transport the D3 that you made in the skin, or the D3 that you ingested orally, to the liver for it to be first activated into its intermediate. The vitamin D binding protein is the product of the vitamin D binding protein gene. The VDBP gene comes in 2 versions. A version that is really good, really efficient at transporting vitamin D. That's your Greyhound bus, your multiple-seater bus that can transport a lot of vitamin D. Or there's a 2-seater tuk-tuk version of this gene. The transporter, the vitamin D binding protein that it produces, isn't really efficient at transporting the vitamin D. And depending on which of these 2 versions you have, you now know something that is radically important and potentially radically different from the person next to you, which is, if I take my vitamin D supplement, if I make my vitamin D through sunlight exposure, am I even transporting it efficiently? Because remember, that D3 is fat soluble. If it is not bound by its transporter, its stability in the bloodstream is not very good at all, and it's not going to reach its intended target, the liver. So we test for, and we'll talk a little bit about testing later on, we look at the VDBP binding protein, but we're not just looking at it as a sort of data point. We're looking at it because it tells the story of your entire vitamin D system. Now you get to the liver. We mentioned that there's a CYP2R1 gene. That gene produces the enzyme that activates the vitamin D. Well, guess what, Tara? That gene comes in 2 versions. A version that is very efficient at activating the D3 into the 25-hydroxycholesterol, and a version that's not very efficient. Well, can you imagine if you had the low carrying capacity vitamin D binding protein and the inefficient CYP2R1, and you happen to think, well, nobody told me vitamin D is important, and OHIP doesn't cover it, so it's definitely not important. So I don't take vitamin D, and I don't give it to my children in December, January, February. And those children are going through radically important points in their development, prepubescent, protection from viral infections, something that's very important in our times that we live in, because we just didn't think it to be important. Okay? Versus the person who has the very efficient vitamin D binding protein and the very efficient CYP2R1 gene. We continue further. When the activated 1,25-dihydroxycholesterol got into the cell, remember that hormone can do nothing. Hormones can accomplish nothing in the human body until they bind to their receptors. And the vitamin D receptor, the VDR, is the product of yet another gene. And guess what? The VDR gene comes in two versions. A version that has a strong affinity for its thing, its vitamin, the 1,25-dihydroxycholesterol, and a version that is not very high capacity binding. So what we do in this Tara is what is called intelligent functional genomics. It's not about genomics to get these little data points, but rather it's genomics that explains how the human body works. Where is your child? Where are you? I'm a Caribbean mutt, as is somewhat obvious, right? I've got, too many ethnic backgrounds, but generally speaking, my South Asian ethnic background speaks through a little bit more than my other mutty backgrounds. And so I come from a people that are designed to live in equatorial climates. I come from a people that are designed to be exposed to the sun 365 days a year, 6 to 8 hours a day. So it is not surprising at all that my vitamin D binding protein gene is not very efficient. It's not surprising at all that my vitamin D receptor gene is not very efficient. Why? Because in my native environment, I make so much of the precursor, so much of the D3, that my body is never at want for the precursor. So because the other downstream operations are less efficient, I'm still relatively okay. But you take me from my traditional, ancestral home, and I come to this beautiful country, Canada, the home of my parents, it's the only home that I know. But now I have left my genetic heritage lands, and for 4 months of the year, I'm not exposed to the sun unless I travel south. And my genes were not designed as Northern Europeans or people of indigenous northern latitudes. So I am completely ill-equipped. People like myself and people that are listening that have similar ethnic backgrounds. And by the way, it's not just colored individuals. You can have individuals, and Tara is smiling because she knows well this. You can have someone that is of Caucasian descent. And I always joke with those clients. I'm like, where did that forefather come from? In other words, there are many Caucasian individuals that have a suboptimal vitamin D receptor, or that have a suboptimal vitamin D binding protein, or that have a suboptimal CYP2R1. And the only way that you're going to know this, which is the only way that you're going to know, are you actually taking sufficient levels of vitamin D? Are you taking it at optimal times in the day? Is by understanding this functional manual. And I close with just one more point. Even when someone becomes aware of the importance of vitamin D and its importance as a precursor to the hormones, how many of us, Tara, understand that for us to optimally benefit from our vitamin D supplementation, which we should be taking as Canadians in our northern winters, how many of us are aware that we absolutely need magnesium and boron? Both of those minerals are needed as cofactors for the body to actually make use. Those enzymes, the one in the liver, the one in the kidney that is responsible for activating the D3 into its hormone. Those enzymes are dependent on magnesium to make the conversion from the precursor into the hormone. Magnesium, Tara, that is something that has become woefully limited because of the quality of our vegetables and our soil. Health Canada has issued a warning many years ago that many Canadians are at risk of low magnesium levels, which you can only determine by it's called an RBC magnesium, red blood cell magnesium test, not serum magnesium. And finally, boron is needed to help stabilize that vitamin D in the bloodstream so that it can get to the kidney, so that it can get into the bloodstream, so that it can get into our cells. So if we're taking vitamin D, bravo. If we're taking the right levels of it, double bravo. But if you're not taking it with your magnesium adequately, with your boron, or at least getting those things in your diet adequately, you're still not completing the puzzle. This is the wonder of vitamin D. This is the wonderment of functional genomics. And this is just the tip of the iceberg. I hope we've created something that spurs an interest in your audience, Tara.
Yeah, I mean, first of all, I can't think of anybody better to walk everybody through that in that way. It's a lot to take in, but I think what's really important is I'm going to be linking to a number of different articles and research studies just to sort of circle back to our kids and what they're dealing with. And we see, and I was talking to Dr. Mansoor about this before we started recording today, we see a lot of the research that, we talk about autism as a neuroimmune condition. We talk about ADHD in terms of there's studies around deficiency specifically in vitamin D, which makes complete sense when you explain about the impact on the receptors for dopamine. So it all comes together when you talk about this, why it was so important to have this conversation today and understand those connections between all the systems in the body, because it is a hormone that we're dealing with and the impact is pervasive. So I hope that at a minimum, that everybody takes away that, and that we can tie that back obviously to what your kids are challenging. What the great thing about this is that when you understand what is specific to your child in terms of what Dr. Mansoor was talking about their ability, like how much vitamin D they need, their ability to convert it, and all of those things. So which you can find out that piece of the puzzle through functional genomic testing, which is I think is incredibly important, because I think the one thing we've learned about these kids is every kid is different. And that's why no one thing works for anyone, like every child, but there's no silver bullet. But when you start looking at it from a personalized medicine standpoint, which functional genomics is the foundation of that, it really can be impactful in terms of starting to get through the fog of where do I go next and what should I be focused on right now. So one of the reasons why I wanted Dr. Aside from educating us on all of this, is because Dr. Mansoor has his company, the DNA company, has a service that I think is really fantastic for families like ours, to get this information, but also then to interpret this information and help you come out on the other side with an actual steps to take. And you can do that with your practitioner or one of their the clinicians that are trained in their reports and how this all works. So actually, can you just explain that process with the DNA company? So if someone was to engage your company to help them with functional genomics, what does that look like for them?
So the first thing, and thank you again, Tara, and this is, never for our audience to make this about the commercialization. I speak about these subject matters purely academically, independent of our testing. And so everything I've said to you is mired or is embedded in proper academic published research. And then, of course, we do offer at least the ability to test what we've just spoken of, which is what we do as a company. And we only test for those things. So the first of the things is when we test for something, we're not testing for genes as a data grab, just to start collecting genetic information. We're testing for things that are fully published and vetted in the scientific literature for humans, not just animal testing, but what is its impact in humans? This is the first differentiation. When you ask what we do, the genes that we test for must meet the criteria that they explain
human behavior. It's not just a data point. It must be able, when we test for that gene, we determine whether you have whatever version of that gene. For it to be included in what we test for, it must be something that is interpretable, that explains something important about the human body. This is the first. The second is that it's a completely non-invasive. It's a saliva-based test. And we have two kit options there. The more routine is it's a saliva kit based on, to give the expression, it's a spit tube. You're literally going to be opening up a cap, spitting in the tube, literally just a mill, the type of thing that you get from just a normal spit. And then you're going to close that tube, and there's a little bit of special solution, and off you go. Once you've given your sample, really important, it's extremely stable. So once you have put your sample into the tube, closed the tube, it can actually stay for weeks, months, completely stable. The other kit that we have, as we began to learn with our audiences, sometimes with either younger children or children with developmental concerns that couldn't spit on demand, is that we've got a swab kit. So that rather than having them spit, we swab in that cheek, and we can use that as well. So non-invasive. Then the sample is extracted. We get the DNA from your saliva, because by the way, your saliva has your DNA. Then we get all of the data that we want, those genes that we need testing. And here, Tara, is something really worth pointing out. Number one, by the way, as a give back to your community, Tara, I'm sure you'll let your community know, we give a discount, really, because this is a passion project for us as a company for the children. So we have a discount to your community that we give, number one. Number two, we're extremely proud of working with two giants in the industry. Mr. Dave Asprey, for many of our parents and health individuals out there, he is in the top 1% of downloaded podcasts and in the top 1% of health podcasts. He has spent, this was a gentleman, Silicon Valley gurus, made all the money one can make, had health concerns, and realized that he needed to take a more proactive step. He has become an advocate of human health. He has, through millions upon millions of funding, has curated nutrition needs and so on and so forth. We are incredibly jazzed, and he is jazzed to work with us. He now, along with myself, we are advisors to the company, myself as the geneticist, and him as the insight of the leagues and leagues of clinical studies and trials that he overlooks to give us the best nutrient options. That's like something that he really focuses on. What are the best nutrients? What are the best versions of the nutrients? What are the best sources of nutrients? So we use that knowledge there. And then most recently, and this is something that for me was one of the proudest moments in our company, the third advisor that makes up our scientific core group, myself, Dave Asprey, is Dr. B.J. Fogg. And for those of you out there, Dr. B.J. Fogg is one of the most storied, tenured professors at Stanford University, and he is the father of what is called human behavioral sciences. He literally writes and wrote the book, literally and figuratively, on understanding the drivers of human behavior. So much so that many of his class graduates are the CEOs in Silicon Valley that goes on to form the companies the like of LinkedIn and Instagram and so on and so forth. And he is year after year voted as the top professor and one of the most, when students go to a class and it changes their worldview, it inspires them. That's Dr. B.J. Fogg. Dr. Fogg does not work lightly with industry. Because of his storied academic position, we are thrilled that he has come on board as the third in our triad of scientific advisors. So we've got the genetics, we've got the consumer viewpoint of what are the best options, the therapeutics, the nutraceutics of it. And what Dr. B.J. Fogg contributes is he has helped us revamp all of our reports through the lenses of human behavior, so that the information, I can go on, this is my passion, I probably bore the likes out of anyone in the audience, and I'll still be bright-eyed talking about genetics. But BJ takes this information and he helped us create our reports so that they're navigatable, they're interpretable, they're actually a joy to read. My original reports 5 years ago, they're heavy lifting science reports, and I was like, that's the way I want them. But most parents would sort of look at them and go, oh my God, Dr. Mansoor, I need someone to unpack this for me. Dr. BJ Fogg has now helped us transform our reports. So in conclusion, Tara, it's a simple sample. It's non-invasive. And then what you get from it, usually once your sample reaches us in, to be safe, 4 weeks, 3 to 4 weeks, your results are ready, your reports are created, your reports are sent back to you. They are now readable, they're accessible. And then 2 things happen. You have them in that engageable manner. You can share them with your clinician, and or you can access our clinicians for even deeper dives. But the very last thing, Tara, and this is something I hope I'm allowed to say, we're also now getting to the point where we're creating an entire ecosystem that the apps that parents can now use to look at live updates. Once they got a result, more data that comes out, little quick tips, that whole system, we're really putting our minds and we're putting ourselves in the consumer's position and asking how and what does the consumer want from this to really optimize their health through the genomics, and we're building out that ecosystem. So that's what we have, Tara.
Yeah, that's wonderful, because there are so many developments that will continue to come up because the research continues. Absolutely. And to be able to have access to, because obviously you have the raw data there. As you said, you only present and interpret the data that you know has the science and the research behind it. And as that research develops, getting that additional information. Dr. BJ Fogg is phenomenal in terms of the work that he does, and again, helping us with behavior change associated with that, which is a lot of this has to do with that. So it's really spectacular that he's involved in creating, helping formulate the reports in terms of it being very actionable from the parents and for their kids and for themselves. So it is really exciting what you guys are doing. And I want everyone to know that they have the DNA company and Dr. Mansoor have extended a $50 discount on their testing to the My Child Will Thrive community. There'll be links in the show notes about how to get to that. And you can always reach out to our team too if you have any questions about that. But I want to thank you so much for taking the time with us today to walk through all these things. But also, as I said at the beginning of the interview, the work that you do with the autism community and continue to do, we're very grateful for that, because it is through the work that people like you do that we're going to continue to make progress in terms of how to help our kids thrive, even when they start out with a setback, like a diagnosis of autism.
It's an absolute honor, Tara. I'll end by saying, for me, nothing speaks humanity like just watching a child and just watching the beauty, the innocence of a child, and then that connection between a child and a parent that's what being human is based on, in my opinion. And so anything that affects that connection, anything that affects the development of our beautiful children and affects that bond that can be made, is something that I take extremely seriously. I'm a father of 3 beautiful children. And so we're doing, this is not just science for us, it's a passion for us. And thank you so very much for having me on your podcast.
It's my great pleasure. Thanks again for being here with us. So that's a wrap. Thanks for joining me this week on My Child Will Thrive. I'm so passionate about giving you the tools and information you need to help your child recover. And as they say, it takes a village, so join us in the My Child Will Thrive Village Facebook group, where you can meet like-minded parents and stay up to date on everything we have going on at My Child Will Thrive. This is Tara Hunkin, and I'll catch you on the next podcast or over at mychildwillthrive.com.